41 years, and not a single official record of how many children were born on that farm. Not one count. Not one verified number. Not even a question. Because sometimes the most dangerous things in this world aren't hidden. They're ignored. Deliberately. Silently. Repeatedly. And this farm was one of those places. It didn't look unusual. Not from the outside. Just another piece of land. Fenced. Quiet. Isolated. Sitting far from the main road. Surrounded by open fields. And silence. The kind of silence that feels normal at first, until you stay long enough to realize it isn't. There were no signs, no warnings, no fences marked with danger, nothing that would make you stop and think. But something about it still felt off. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly, like a feeling that grows the longer you ignore it. Backhand index pointing right if nothing was wrong. Then why did it feel like something was being hidden? The people who lived there rarely left. And when they did, they didn't stay long. They spoke little, answered less, and never invited anyone inside. Not neighbors, not workers, not strangers. Because whatever existed on that farm was not meant to be seen. At least, not completely. But there was one thing people did notice. Children. Always children. Different faces. Different ages. Sometimes a group. Sometimes just one or two. Playing near the edge of the field. Watching from a distance. Silent. Observing. And then gone. As if they were never there. Backhand index pointing right. Where did those children come from? And why did they disappear so quickly? Fearful face. At first, no one questioned it. Because farms have families. Families have children. That part made sense. But over time, the pattern didn't. Because the numbers didn't stay the same. They changed. Too often. Too quickly. 1 month, there would be 3 children. The next, 5. Then 2. Then none. And then suddenly, more again. Without explanation. Without reason. As if they weren't being counted at all. Backhand index pointing right. How can the number of children keep changing, without anyone noticing? There were no school records. No enrollment. No attendance. No names listed anywhere. Not in nearby towns. Not in official systems. It was as if those children didn't exist. At least not on paper. And in a world where everything is recorded, everything is tracked, everything is documented, that kind of absence isn't normal. It's intentional. Backhand index pointing right. If they weren't recorded, then who was making sure they stayed invisible? Fire. The locals knew about the farm. Of course they did. Places like this always have a reputation. But when asked, they didn't explain. They didn't deny. They just avoided the conversation. Changed the subject. Looked away. Because sometimes silence is not ignorance. It's fear. Backhand index pointing right. What were they afraid of saying? And who were they afraid of? Fearful face. Deliveries were rare. And when they happened, They were handled quickly. No conversations, no delays, just a transaction and departure, because no one stayed longer than necessary. No one looked too closely. No one asked too many questions, because deep down, everyone understood one thing. That farm was not normal, even if no one could explain why. The years passed, one after another, quietly, without interruption, without investigation, without accountability. 41 years. And still, no count, no official number of children born, no confirmed identities, no record of where they went, or what happened to them. Backhand index pointing right. How can something so significant go unnoticed for so long? Skull. Because no one was looking. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Not a secret. Not a cover-up. Just absence. Absence of attention. Absence of concern. Absence of questions. And in that absence, anything can happen. Even something like this. The farm continued operating. Season after season. Unchanged. Unquestioned. As if time itself had chosen to ignore it. But time doesn't ignore anything. It just waits. Waits for someone to notice, to question, to count. Backhand index pointing right. If no one was counting, then what was really growing on that farm all those years? Fearful face. And then one day, after 41 years of silence, someone finally did. Not a neighbor, not a passerby, but someone who didn't belong to the silence. Someone who didn't accept missing answers. Someone who understood that numbers matter. A judge. And the moment that question was asked, everything changed. Because once you start counting, you start uncovering. And once you uncover something like this, you can't hide it again. When the judge finally began to count, the numbers didn't just fail to match, they revealed something far worse. So the real question is, what was hidden in those missing numbers for 41 years? Patterns don't appear all at once. They form slowly, quietly, hidden inside routine, so familiar that no one questions them, until someone does. And on that farm, for 41 years, the pattern was always there, just never acknowledged. The first person to notice it wasn't looking for it. They weren't investigating. They weren't suspicious. They were just doing their job. A simple visit, a routine stop, the kind of moment that usually passes without memory. But this time, something didn't add up. It started with a number, or more accurately, the lack of one. The outsider had been there before. Once, maybe twice. Long enough to recognize faces. Long enough to remember details. And that's when it became clear. The children weren't the same. Not just older. Different. New. And yet, there was no record of them ever arriving. No explanation. No introduction. They were just there, as if they had always been there. But they hadn't. And that difference was enough to create doubt. At first, it was ignored, because doubt is uncomfortable, and it's easier to dismiss something than to investigate it. But doubt doesn't disappear. It grows, quietly, until it demands attention. The outsider returned again, this time more observant, more aware, and the pattern became clearer, too clear to ignore. There were more children than before, but still, no signs of documentation, no visible records, no official acknowledgement. It was as if those children existed only within the boundaries of that farm, nowhere else. And that realization changed everything, because in a system built on records, on names, on identities, you cannot exist without being counted, unless someone is making sure you aren't. The outsider asked questions, simple ones at first. How many children live here? The answer came quickly, too quickly. Just a few. No number, no detail, just a phrase. And phrases like that are designed to end conversations, not answer them. The outsider pressed further. How many have been born here? This time, there was hesitation, a pause, just long enough to feel intentional, and then, a vague response. Over the years, some. Not a number, not a count, just enough words to avoid saying anything at all. And that was the moment the pattern became undeniable. Because when a question has a clear answer, people give it. But when they don't, there's always a reason. The outsider left that day, but not with answers, with something else. Suspicion. And suspicion is the beginning of truth. A report was filed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. Just a note. A concern. Something to be reviewed. But concerns like that don't always lead to action, because systems rely on proof. And proof requires evidence. And evidence requires access. And that farm didn't allow access. The initial response was routine. A brief check. A few questions. A short visit. And then, nothing. Because everything appeared normal. At least on the surface. No visible danger. No immediate threat. No obvious violation. Just a quiet farm, with a quiet family, living a quiet life. And sometimes, that's enough to close a case, even when it shouldn't be. The report was dismissed, filed away, forgotten, just like everything else connected to that place. But the pattern didn't disappear. It continued, unchanged, uninterrupted. More children appeared. More faces came and went. Still no records. Still no numbers. Still no accountability. And over time, even the outsider stopped asking. Because when a system gives you no answers, you eventually stop expecting them. And that's how patterns survive. Not through secrecy, but through exhaustion, through silence, through the absence of persistence. The locals had seen it too. Of course they had. But they didn't speak. Not openly. Not directly. Because they had learned something long before the outsider ever arrived. That some questions don't lead to answers. They lead to consequences. So they chose silence, because silence feels safer, even when it isn't. The farm continued operating, season after season, year after year. Children born, children gone. No records, no count, no trace. And slowly, that pattern became invisible again, not because it disappeared, but because no one was looking anymore. Until one day, years later, someone else did. Not by accident, not by routine, but by intention. Because somewhere, inside old files, old reports, old records, a detail didn't match, a number didn't align, a gap appeared, and this time it wasn't ignored, because the person who noticed it didn't rely on assumptions, didn't accept incomplete answers, didn't close cases without resolution. They counted, they compared, they questioned, and what they found didn't just raise suspicion, it demanded investigation. Because now, the pattern wasn't just a feeling, it was data, missing data, repeated data, contradicting data, and data doesn't lie, not when someone is willing to read it. And this time, someone was. When the numbers were finally compared, they didn't just fail to match, they exposed a pattern so precise, it couldn't have been accidental. So the real question is, if it wasn't a mistake, then who was controlling the numbers all along? Some people look at missing numbers and move on. They assume it's an error, a mistake, a gap that doesn't matter. But then there are others who understand something deeper, that when numbers don't match, it's not always a mistake. Sometimes it's a decision, and the person who noticed it didn't ignore it. He couldn't, because patterns like this don't disappear on their own. They are created, maintained, protected, and for 41 years, this pattern had survived, without interruption, until it reached someone who didn't rely on assumptions. A judge, not someone who visits farms, not someone who observes from a distance, but someone who works with facts, with records, with truth, or at least, what truth is supposed to look like on paper. It started quietly, a review of old files. Routine, standard, the kind of work that rarely leads to anything unusual. But buried inside those files was something that didn't fit. A repeated absence, a missing count, one location, appearing again and again and again, the same farm, different years, different reports, different cases, but always the same problem. No clear number of children, no consistent record, just fragments, incomplete, disconnected. At first glance, it looked like poor documentation, negligence, clerical error, but the more it appeared, the less accidental it seemed, because mistakes don't repeat this precisely. They scatter, they vary, but this pattern stayed consistent, too consistent. The judge didn't dismiss it, didn't file it away, didn't label it as incomplete. Instead, he did something simple. He started counting. He pulled records from different years, placed them side by side, compared them, and that's when the problem became visible. Not in one document, but across all of them. The numbers didn't just fail to match. They contradicted each other. One record suggested a small number of children. Another implied more. A third didn't mention them at all, as if entire groups had been erased, or never acknowledged to begin with. And when that happens, in a system built on structure, on verification, on accountability, it means something is wrong. Not superficially, fundamentally. The judge requested more data. Older records, archived material, anything connected to that farm. And as the files came in, the pattern grew stronger, not weaker, because now it wasn't just one inconsistency. It was dozens, spanning years, decades, 41 years of incomplete truth. At that point, this was no longer a clerical issue. It was a case, an investigation, official, unavoidable, because once something enters the system like that, it demands resolution, and the judge was not someone who left things unresolved. The order was issued, a formal inquiry, into the farm, into its records, into everything that had been ignored. For decades, authorities were assigned, not for a quick visit, not for a surface-level check, but for a detailed inspection, the kind that doesn't accept vague answers, the kind that doesn't stop at the gate. And for the first time, in 41 years, that farm was about to be examined properly. The day they arrived, nothing looked different. The fields were the same. The house was the same. The silence was the same. Because places like that don't change for outsiders. They adapt. They hide. They remain exactly what they need to be, to avoid suspicion. The people on the farm knew something was different, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. Questions were no longer casual. They were direct, specific, measured. How many children live here? This time, the question wasn't optional, and the answer couldn't be vague. But it still was, because even under pressure, some patterns don't break easily. The number given didn't match the records, didn't match the observations, didn't match reality, and that discrepancy was noted. Everything was noted. The layout of the farm, the structure of the house, the presence of children, their behavior, their silence, because something about them didn't feel natural. They didn't speak much, didn't interact normally, didn't respond the way children usually do, as if they had learned not to. And that kind of behavior doesn't happen without reason. The authorities requested documentation, birth records, medical history, identification, anything that could confirm how many children had been born and where they were now. The response was incomplete. Again, some documents were provided, most were not, and the ones that were didn't align. Dates missing, names repeated, Details altered, as if the records had been maintained, but not honestly. And that distinction matters, because false records are worse than no records. They create an illusion of truth, while hiding something else entirely. The judge reviewed the findings carefully, line by line, detail by detail, and what emerged was no longer a pattern. It was a system, structured, consistent, deliberate, because nothing about this was random. Nothing about this was accidental. For 41 years, someone had controlled the numbers, adjusted them, reduced them, erased them, and made sure no one questioned it. Until now. Because now there was a record of the inconsistency, an official acknowledgement, a documented problem. And once something like that exists, it can't be ignored again. The investigation expanded beyond the farm, into surrounding areas, into past reports, into missing cases, and slowly, connections began to form. Names that appeared briefly, then disappeared. Families that reported nothing, but had gaps in their history. Children who were never officially recorded, but somehow existed. All leading back to the same place, the same farm. At that point, there was only one conclusion left. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't error. This was control. Control over identity, over existence, over whether someone was counted or forgotten. And that kind of control doesn't happen without purpose. It serves something, something hidden, something protected. And now, for the first time, that protection was breaking. When the judge finally connected the records, it became clear this wasn't just missing data. It was a controlled system hiding something far bigger. So the real question is, if the children were being controlled on paper, then what was really happening to them in reality? Truth doesn't always reveal itself loudly. Sometimes it waits, buried beneath routine, hidden inside ordinary places, protected by silence. And on that farm, for 41 years, the truth had been there, not invisible, just unexamined. Until now, the investigation didn't stop at questions. It moved deeper, beyond conversations, beyond surface-level observations, into the structure itself. Because patterns like this don't exist without a foundation. And if the numbers were controlled, then something physical had to support it. The first signs were subtle. Rooms that weren't listed. Spaces that didn't appear on any layout. Doors that remained closed, even when everything else was open. At first, they seemed insignificant, just parts of an old building. But in a place where records didn't match, even small details mattered. So they opened them, one by one, and with each door, the silence grew heavier, because what they found wasn't just unusual, it was intentional. Inside those hidden spaces, there were signs of occupancy. Beds, worn, used, but not accounted for. Clothing, different sizes, different ages. Too many, for the number of children officially present. And that was the first undeniable confirmation. There were more children on that farm than anyone had admitted. Not by mistake, by design. The rooms weren't temporary. They weren't storage. They were living spaces, maintained, reused, as if they had been part of a system, for years. And systems like that don't exist without purpose. The investigators documented everything. Photographs, measurements, details. Because now, this wasn't suspicion anymore. This was evidence. The kind that changes everything. As they moved further inside, the structure revealed more. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight. There were patterns in the rooms, groups, separated by age, arranged in a way that suggested organization, not chaos, control, because nothing about this was random. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose, even the absence of records, especially the absence of records. The question wasn't whether children had been hidden. That was already clear. The question was, why? Why hide them? Why erase them from official existence? Why maintain a system like this for 41 years? The answer didn't come immediately, because truth rarely does. It builds, layer by layer, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The investigators found ledgers, not official ones, private, handwritten, stored away from the rest of the house, hidden, but not destroyed, as if someone wanted them to survive, but not to be found easily. Inside those ledgers, there were names, not all of them complete, not all of them consistent, but enough to see a pattern. Births recorded, dates listed, numbers that had never appeared in any official system. And next to some of those names, there were markings, symbols, codes, not explanations, just indicators. And those indicators raised more questions than answers, because they suggested something else. Movement, change, transition, as if those children had been tracked internally, but never externally. The farm wasn't ignoring records. It was replacing them, creating its own system, its own count, separate from everything else. And that realization was more disturbing than the absence itself, because it meant control wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, maintained, perfected over time. The investigators continued, beyond the rooms, beyond the ledgers, into areas that had remained untouched, or at least untouched by outsiders. And that's where the truth became clearer. There were signs of restriction, not just physical, behavioral. Children who didn't speak, children who avoided eye contact, children who responded only when addressed directly, and even then, with hesitation, as if communication itself had been limited, controlled, learned, because when people grow up in a system like that, they don't question it, they accept it as normal, as the only reality they've ever known. And that was the most unsettling part. These children didn't know they were missing. They didn't know they weren't counted. Because to them, this was life. And life doesn't feel wrong when it's all you've ever experienced. The investigation expanded again. Not just within the farm, but beyond it, into external connections. Because systems like this don't exist in isolation. They interact. They connect. They serve a purpose outside their own boundaries. And slowly, those connections began to appear. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to suggest something bigger. Transfers. Movements. Children who appeared in one place, then disappeared from another. Without documentation. Without trace. Without explanation. And always linked back to the same origin. The same farm. At that point, there was no uncertainty left. This wasn't just about missing records. This was about missing identities. People who existed, but were never acknowledged. Lives that were lived, but never recorded. And systems like that don't just happen. They are built, maintained, protected, for a reason. The question now was not what had happened. That was becoming clear. The question was, who allowed it to continue for 41 years? Because something like this cannot survive on its own. It requires silence, not just inside the farm, but outside it, in the systems meant to prevent it. And that realization shifted the investigation again, from discovery to accountability. Because once the truth is uncovered, the focus changes, from what happened to why it was allowed, and who made that possible. The judge reviewed everything. The rooms, the ledgers, the inconsistencies, the patterns, and came to a conclusion that could no longer be avoided. This wasn't a hidden mistake. This was a hidden system. And now, it had been exposed. But exposure is only the beginning. Because once something like this is revealed, it doesn't end. It expands into consequences, into responsibility, into answers that people may not be ready to face. And as the investigation moved toward its final stage, one thing became clear. The numbers they had found were not the full truth. Not yet. Because even within the hidden records, there were gaps, missing entries, unfinished counts, as if even the internal system was incomplete. And that meant one thing: there were still children who had never been recorded anywhere, not officially, not internally, not at all. And if that was true, then the scale of what had happened was even larger than they thought. When the hidden records were finally uncovered, they didn't just reveal the truth, they revealed gaps within the truth itself. So the real question is, if even the secret system was incomplete, then how many children were never counted at all? Counting seems simple. A number, a total, something that gives clarity. But sometimes, counting doesn't bring answers. It reveals something worse. Because when the judge ordered the final count, he wasn't just asking for numbers. He was asking for truth. And truth, after 41 years, was not going to be simple. The order was official, documented, irreversible. Every child connected to that farm had to be accounted for, not estimated, not approximated, counted, individually, with identity, with proof, because for the first time, the system that had ignored them was now forced to recognize them. The process began slowly, carefully, because nothing about this case was straightforward. The records were incomplete, the internal ledgers contradictory, and the reality even more complex. Teams were assigned, not just to review documents, but to trace lives, to identify children, to connect names to faces, and faces to histories. But that's where the problem began, because many of those faces had no history, no official birth, no recorded existence, nothing that connected them to the world outside that farm. And when a person has no record, they become difficult to count, not because they aren't real, but because systems don't recognize what they can't verify. And that meant one thing: even with the investigation, some children would remain invisible. The count continued, day after day, file after file, name after name, some confirmed, some partially verified, some impossible to trace. And with each number added, the weight of the truth grew heavier, because the total was rising, higher than expected, higher than the official records suggested, higher than anyone had imagined. And yet, even that number didn't feel complete, because the gaps remained, silent, unresolved. The judge reviewed the progress, not just the numbers, but what they represented. Lives, uncounted, unacknowledged, 4 decades, and now, finally being seen. But too late, because time doesn't return what it takes. The farm was no longer just under investigation. It was under control, restricted, monitored, every movement observed, every interaction documented, because once something like this is exposed, it can't be allowed to continue. The people involved were questioned, separately, carefully, and their answers didn't align, not completely. Some denied knowledge, some claimed confusion, some remained silent, but none of them provided a clear explanation, and that absence of explanation was its own kind of answer, because when something has been hidden for that long, the truth isn't just buried, it's fragmented, broken into pieces that no longer fit together easily. The children were moved, one by one, taken from the only place they had ever known, placed into a system they had never been part of. And for many of them, that transition was not relief. It was confusion, because they didn't understand what had happened, didn't understand why they were being taken, didn't understand what had been done to them, because to them there had been no before, only the farm, only that life. And now, even that was gone. The count continued, until it reached a number, a final number, or at least, the closest thing to one. And when that number was presented, it changed everything, not because it was exact, but because it was undeniable. The scale of what had happened could no longer be ignored, could no longer be dismissed, could no longer be hidden. The case became public, not quietly, not gradually, but suddenly, because something like this cannot remain contained once it is exposed. The world saw the numbers, heard the story, learned about the farm, and asked the same question. How? How could something like this happen for 41 years? Without intervention, without accountability, without anyone stopping it. And there was no simple answer, because systems fail quietly, gradually, over time, until failure becomes normal, and normal becomes invisible. The farm was sealed, closed, no longer active, no longer functioning, but not erased, because places like that leave something behind, not physically, but historically, a mark, a reminder of what happens when no one is counting. The investigation concluded, officially, with findings, with documentation, with a number. But even then, it didn't feel complete, because some names were still missing, some identities still unverified, some children still unaccounted for. And that meant one thing: the truth was still incomplete, even after everything, even after the count. And that is what makes this story different. Not the discovery, not the investigation, not even the outcome, but the fact that even now, after all the answers, there are still questions, questions that may never be resolved, questions that exist in the space between what was found and what was lost. Because in the end, counting doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes it just reveals how much is missing. The judge completed the count, but even that number wasn't the full truth, because some lives had already disappeared beyond record, beyond memory, beyond reach. So the final question is, if even the official count couldn't find them, then how many were truly lost, and will they ever be found? In the end, it wasn't the farm that shocked people the most. Not the hidden rooms, not the missing records, not even the number itself. It was something far more unsettling: the silence. Because for 41 years, nothing about this was truly invisible. The children were there. They lived. They grew. They existed. Right in front of everyone. And yet, they were never counted. Not officially. Not properly. Not enough. Because sometimes, the most dangerous system is not the one that hides things. It's the one that looks at them and chooses not to see. The farm didn't operate in isolation. It survived because no one forced it to stop. Because questions were not asked. Because doubts were ignored. Because silence was easier than truth. And over time, that silence became protection, not for the children, but for the system itself. A system where existence depended on recognition, and recognition was deliberately denied. The judge didn't discover something new. he uncovered something that had always been there, something that had been allowed to continue for decades. Because once he started counting, the illusion collapsed. The numbers didn't just reveal lives. They exposed absence, gaps, discrepancies. And behind those gaps were stories, untold, unrecorded, unheard. Some children were found, identified, given names, given recognition for the first time, but others remained missing, not physically, but historically, because without records, without identity, it's as if they were never there at all. And that is the darkest part of this story. Not what was done, but what was lost. Because once a life goes uncounted, unrecorded, unrecognized, it doesn't just disappear from systems. It disappears from memory, from history, from existence itself. The farm is closed now. Silent. Still. Just another piece of land. But what happened there didn't end with its closure. Because places don't carry responsibility. People do. And systems do. And this system failed. Not once. Not suddenly. But slowly. Over 41 years. The count came. Eventually. But by then, it was too late to make it complete. Too late to recover everything. Too late to fix what had already been erased. Because counting after the fact doesn't restore what was never acknowledged. It only reveals how much was lost. And that loss cannot be measured. Not in numbers. Not in records. Not even in memory. Because some of those children will never be found. Not because they don't exist, but because no one knows where to look. And maybe that's the real story. Not about a farm. Not about a judge. Not even about the system. But about the consequences of not asking questions, of not paying attention, of allowing silence to replace truth. Because in the end, this wasn't just about children who weren't counted. It was about a world that didn't notice they were missing. And now, even after everything, there is still one question left. The one that matters most. Skull, if it took 41 years for someone to finally count, then how many other places are still waiting for someone to notice? Fire.